someone will say gold is very expensive. Uh, in my view, that is true. It's expensive, but it's more a reflection of the value of money that has gone down, collapsed.
They now have to keep printing or we crash.
We've got this ticking time bomb.
Talking gold with the one and only Andrew Maguire.
Welcome to Live from the Vault.
Hi there, my name is Shane Moran, and I'll be the host for this week's episode of Live from the Vault, and welcome to the show that goes beyond the headlines and uncovers the truth about the precious metals industry and the effects on the global economy in these historic times. We have exclusive access to experts, and we have exclusive access to insiders, and we reveal information and insights that you simply won't find anywhere else. Now, this week, we have the one and only Andrew Maguire, precious metals expert and whistleblower in the vault, and to help him pull back the curtain, we'll be joined by a returning guest and by popular demand by you, our Live from the Vault community, global economics expert, Dr. Marc Faber from Doom, Gloom, and Boom.com. That's right. We've got Dr. Faber in the vault, and you're not going to want to miss a word about this whole conversation here. So just before we introduce our featured guest and head over to the UK, I want to remind you to please help keep spreading the word about this channel. And you can help us here just by hitting that like button if you haven't already done so, and hit the share button to get this information out to more people. If you haven't already subscribed, you can do that. And if you click on the bell right there, we'll notify you as each episode goes live. Now, for those of you who haven't already met Dr. Marc Faber, he studied at the University of Zurich and earned his PhD in economics at the age of 24. He's considered one of the world's premier economists and stock market investors, known for his contrarian investment approach. Now, Dr. Faber is renowned for his timely market predictions. You're not going to want to miss a word here. And he's also the author of Amazon bestsellers called Tomorrow's Gold, which is Asia's Age of Discovery. He's been a regular contributor on several of the world's leading financial publications, and he is the publisher of the widely read Gloom, Boom, and Doom report at www.gloomboomdoom.com. And with that, let's head over to the UK and talking gold with the one and only Andrew Maguire and our featured guest, Mr. and Dr. Marc Faber. Over to you, Andy.
Well, actually, this is definitely a treat for us here at Live from the Vault. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence today.
Well, thank you for having me, and a good day to all your spectators and listeners. And I'm happy to participate in any discussion you may wish to have.
Well, I think this is an opportunity for us to cast that net a little bit wider. I mean, we are unashamed gold bugs, but it all interconnects. And I think sometimes to get that view onto how all the pieces, obviously not, but as many of these pieces as possible all interconnect. I think sometimes we get so focused on one thing that this is why I think it's so important. And I mean, Marc, I've been following you for the best part of 30-something years. And in fact, you wrote the book on contrarian investment. And I think you've inspired a hell of a lot of other well-respected names out there that I come across all the time. And really, what you're doing is you're making an effort for us to look beyond the staged market narrative. And as I say, thank you for sharing some precious time with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for this nice introduction and the exaggeration about my skills.
Not at all. I think we view you obviously it's honestly, this is not just me saying it. This is a light in the dark, and I think we really appreciate. Obviously, while we're going to appreciate talking a bit of gold and silver in a little bit later today, but having you here to answer some economic questions, that really interests me. And as a long-time follower of your work, I've rightly learned to be extremely skeptical of the statistics published by the government.
Yes.
And so the reason I say this is we've got non-farm payrolls. We're recording this the day before non-farm payrolls tomorrow. And given this is the last report before the US election. I mean, I personally wouldn't be surprised if it was a politically sought beat, regardless of the number. And we've seen in the past, every single beat last year, in the last 12 months, revised higher later, which no one seems to notice. And then to add insult to injury, then they did a 1 year update and the whole lot was revised lower. What do you actually see as we approach this event?
Well, I want to point out I'm not a labor economist, because this is now a very specialized sphere of the economic art or function or lies. But it seems to me that a lot of fully employed people have been laid off or are no longer required to go to work, and then they are being replaced by unskilled workers and part-time workers and so forth. And then we have to analyze, when we read how many people were employed, we should focus on the quality of employment. Say, if the government decides to make the figures look good, they could hire an additional 100,000 people that are basically useless or actually hindering or making economic growth difficult, because they go and install increasing number of regulations and laws to make the life of small business owners more difficult. So we have to be very careful. There are productive jobs and there are unproductive jobs. Now, I'm not saying that the whole entertainment industry is unproductive, but if you analyze, is someone employed in a factory to do a job in a, say, specialized function, or is someone working part-time for Disney to accommodate some foreigners that travel to the US, or a family of the US that goes and spends money in an overpriced entertainment venue, in my view. You understand? So equally healthcare, the whole healthcare industry is not the most growth enhancing industry, but you could argue, well, it keeps people alive. Yes, if it's economically, if it makes sense to keep someone who is 85 years old alive for another 5 years, in my view, not. But someone could interject or argue, well, he's a great value to the family and so forth. Normally, at 85, people are no longer great value to the family.
Well, and also, I think that kind of brings into it's almost the elephant in the room, I think, is the degree of unknowns that have moved, that have actually infiltrated the US, the UK, Europe, and we're talking about migrants. And I have no problem with migrants have been very useful for the globe. I mean, you come in, you add talents, you bring talents, you integrate, you make a nation greater. But when you have millions of unknown people coming into the economy, and many of them are not productive, that has to be a big worry.
Well, I mean, there's, again, this is a very specialized field, the immigration of people into a country, whether they're beneficial or not. And there are studies, economic studies, that calculate the benefit of someone who comes to the US or someone who comes to Germany. And I'd like to make one observation. In the 19th century, as you know, the US population from 1800 to 1900 grew from approximately 4 million people to about 80 million people in 100 years. And we didn't have any inflation, and we had huge productivity improvements. And the question is, how did these people come and what did they do? Well, they came because living conditions and opportunities in America were better than in Europe. This is the reason they went to the United States. and not to obtain social benefits and to abuse the government's benevolence and to be part of the socialist communist movement. So that I want to state categorically. There are people that come into a country who want to contribute to economic growth of that country. And of course, there were injustices to some extent. But the days of the robber barons were highly productive days, and the conditions in America, in factories in general, I'm not saying in every case, but in general, were better than in Europe. You should see, I have pictures of people who went down into coal mines in England and Belgium at the end of the last century. At the end of the 19th century. There were horrible conditions. And in the US, the conditions were also bad, but they were better than in Europe. That's why so many people came to the United States. And now we have all these floods of immigrants into the US who are partly financed by the socialists. And the same in Europe. We have a big problem in Europe with the immigrants that come into our countries, into European countries, and have no intention whatsoever, zero intention, to adapt to the conditions, to the European culture, to the European morals, and so forth. No desire whatsoever.
I think that is a problem, and I think especially while we see it in Europe, we see some pushback against that coming from various countries. Recently, Austria, then of course, even in Germany, Hungary, and places like this that are pushing back a little, and it seemed, and France perhaps as well. But I think in this country here, since we elected our new prime minister, we're seeing people put into jail for 20 months periods for making tweets, for actually making comments on the internet, which is pretty scary. So this is why it's important to have, these channels open for us to have these kind of talks where we can still do this.
Yes, I mean, what you're suggesting here is absolutely true. In Germany, the established parties, they accuse the AfD of racism and of all sorts of things, and they claim that if the AfD gains power, it will undermine democracy. Similar in the US, they accuse Trump that he will destroy democracy. No, it's exactly the opposite. Precisely the opposite. The people that in the UK are your prime minister and represent him, they don't want free speech because they want to destroy democracy and rule. This is a characteristic of the socialist communists, to have the government having influence on every aspect of your life. They want to destroy individualism. That's why they also against small businesses. They're not supporting small businesses, not at all. They want to destroy small businesses and put everything under a huge government business called the government, who already steals 50% of people's income. If you look at the tax revenues as a percent of GDP in most European cities, or if you look at the government spending, it's mostly in Europe and America, it's close to 50% of the economy's government spending. That's why we have these high deficits. And what do these high deficits do? They lead to money printing because someone has to finance this whole thing. And it leads to inflation, which is a tax. And the tax goes on to poor people and the middle class. The wealthy people, like me, my assets have gone up because of inflation. I shouldn't complain, but I complain as an economist. And my duty as a fellow human is to protect everyone, including the poor and the middle class, because it's very important in a system, in a society, to have a fair society and not an unjust society which favors the few elite government officials and rich people only.
Who are inevitably warmongers because there's profit in war.
Of course, they're interventionists about everything where they can make money, and war is an avenue to make big money. Big. I'm not talking about small money. Big.
Well, I think this is important because I think one of the positives that I see and I connect with a lot of young people is that they no longer get their news from the mainstream. They no longer even attempt to get it from there. And to be honest, this is why they come. They look for Joe Rogan. They look for other views. They look for an awful lot of names that are followed, and they also get their news from really an X, of course. And I must say, you can have different views on Elon Musk, but my goodness me. Whether he is a long-term, there's a game going on or not, I don't know. At face value, he's been very, very positive, and it's a shining light for us because we can actually now. He's actually countered. Even did you see where he published? The European Union threatened him with massive fines, and what he did was he turned around, he published their letter, which said, if you surreptitiously, quietly mute tweets and opinions, they will drop the fines. But he published that letter. Did you happen to see that letter?
No, I didn't see the letter, but I read about it, and I agree with you. It is fortunate that there are people like him who are to some extent dependent on the government for subsidies for his cars. But on the other hand, he also dares to attack them because the governments, the way they've treated ordinary people has been horrible for the last 20, 30 years. Horrible, worse and worse. And the government's move to the left means that people have less freedom and will pay higher taxes in due course. And they will be impoverished. I've been to so many socialist countries. The one thing you can believe me, from the 50s on to the 60s, on up to the 70s, and even Cuba in the 90s, socialism is a religion and ideology of impoverishing the people of a country, of a society, whereas capitalism is an ideology of hope, of self-reliance and struggle, but also reaping the profits from your work. The socialist ideology is one of envy. They want to destroy the rich and the entrepreneurs, put everything under the government, and then it's under the government run by completely incompetent, I'm not saying idiots, but people who've never worked a day in their lives in a business. That is the thing. Nowadays, we have professional politicians. They never worked a day in their lives. They went to a university run by some socialist, left-leaning communists, and they have to believe that because they went to a university, they are smarter than the people. So they intervene into the market, which functioned reasonably well before the interventions.
And you're talking about intelligent people here. You're talking about people who have been educated, but
they are educated. They're not smart.
Right.
They're educated, and they're vicious. That I want to point out. They're vicious, envious of entrepreneurs who have no education but succeeded because of their hard work. That annoys them the most. Someone who has no education and succeeds because he works hard.
Well, I think it's not even a conspiracy theory to think that anyone who is in government is actually just really the useful fools of the globalists and essentially, I mean, really the bureaucrats run everything. I mean, I can't believe for a single minute that Biden has run the US. for the last few years. I can't believe that Kamala Harris, I can't believe that even when Trump was in power, that anything was really different, because ultimately these guys pull all the strings.
I agree with you, but this is a very complex issue. How to run a government? There are philosophical issues about it and so forth. If we observe the Romans, there were many Roman emperors who actually run the business, but in many other cases, it's the bureaucracy that ran it, or the Praetorian Guards.
Yes,
they auctioned off the title of emperors.
Well, this is where history comes in, because there is nothing new, is there? It's all repeat.
It's all been there. It's all been there. But now we have now a stock market that is very large, which didn't exist at the time of the Romans and the Babylonians and so forth.
Well, that's interesting in itself, because I mean, if we get on to the fact that the Fed recently, it looked like a panicked 50 basis point rate cut. But correct me if I'm wrong here. But isn't that unprecedented into nosebleed high stock market valuations?
Well, I've written about this because it's something that interests me, and it goes back to essentially the impact of monetary inflation on a society. Because some people benefit from the monetary inflation; they become immensely rich and influential, and other people, they are impoverished because the cost of living is going up more than their wages, and they also suffer because when you can make money, I mean big money, out of speculating and speculations and speculative activities, it drains actually liquidity from productive sectors of the economy into the speculative sectors of the economy. So some people benefit from the monetary inflation and others suffer. And the Fed rate cut looked probably at a labor market that is weakening or is far weaker than the Biden administration statistics would have suggested. That I want to point out. Because the labor statistics are statistics that are published by the government. Wall Street and the media then takes these statistics and they don't check about the validity of them, and they publish them because they don't want to destroy the inflated asset markets. But the labor market is probably quite weak. So the Fed, if they looked at the labor market, there was maybe a justification for a 0.5% cut. And I know some experts, there are, I mean, people who are knowledgeable about the economy. They think the Fed should have cut even more. This is not my view. But this is where the distortion of the monetary inflation comes in. The labor market is weak, but the asset prices are in the sky. And to cut the Fed fund rate when the Dow and the S&P and the Nasdaq are all at all-time highs, and home prices are at all-time highs, and the Fed knows that the problem of the housing market is affordability. According to Goldman Sachs, affordability is at the lowest point ever in the US. That is a problem. But you understand, the Fed and Wall Street is about one and the same. They don't want to destroy the asset markets. This is a big concern about once you have inflated asset markets, you have to keep juggling them up. So they probably cut rates to prevent stocks from going down. But what they can't do is prevent the dollar from going down. And maybe it won't go down a lot against the euro and the yen. But it went down against gold, which is an honest currency, and it went down against bitcoins. So this is very complex. This is a very complex issue because if you look just at the labor market, maybe 50 basis point cut was justified. I'm not sure about it, but maybe. Some people argue it was justified. But if you look at the asset markets, there's a crazy to cut rates when the asset markets are in the sky.
I think, this is where perhaps I can bring in gold for a minute. I know for certain, having followed you, that you've been advocating accumulating and holding gold for the last, I reckon, 40 years or more. Now, and I remember that was back at $200. But because, suddenly we look at the numbers. We look at $200 when you were advocating by it. Now we're looking at $2,600. Now, so do you view gold as having risen in price, or is it just simply that the cost of fiat currency, it costs more fiat currency? And that raises the interesting question on how inflation, I know you talk about this a lot, it's a two-edged sword, great for asset holders, but terrible for savers and shoppers.
Well, actually, in the recent issue of my report, I discussed two charts. One chart was by the bank credit analyst, and they calculate the gold price in real terms. In other words, inflation adjusted, but inflation adjusted by the figures published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in other words, the government. I have been following for the last 30 or 40 years the conference board, and also a fellow called John Williams. He has a website, shadowstats.com. Now, John Williams is a decent fellow. He has no agenda. He doesn't belong to the Republicans or the Democrats in his views about the economy. He just is a brilliant statistician that takes the figures that lead to cost of living increases as they used to be calculated before 1981 or 82. In other words, the old methodology. Now, according to the bank credit analyst, what is interesting is gold was very inflation adjusted, very depressed in the late 60s before the first big bull market in gold, 1971 to 1980. And then it became again very undervalued in the years 1998 to 2000. It became overvalued in 1980, inflation adjusted, and again in 2011, the last peak of the gold bull market, peak was, I think, in $1,941 or something like this. And then again now it's very overvalued in real terms, according to the government statistics. But according to the statistics published about inflation by John Williams, the price of gold here is exactly where it should be. And I can say, I'm not exaggerating, but say, I grew up with a gold price of $35 an ounce, okay, until 1971. The gold price went then to $850 in 1980, and now it is, say, at 2,600, whatever. My view would be that the cost of things and services is up, say, around 10 times since year 2000. To buy a house and to go, out at night and so forth. I think it's not totally unrealistic. And the gold price is up about 10 times since then. A little bit less. So someone will say gold is very expensive. In my view, that is true. It's expensive, but it's more a reflection of the value of money that has gone down, collapsed. And you understand, before I could say, when I grew up, my grandmother and grandparents always told me, Mark, you have to save money and put the money in a bank on deposit. Don't want to bore you with the story of my deposits in the Kantonalbank Obwalden in Switzerland, but it wasn't a good investment. But the point is, at the time, money in the bank deposit was safe. And nowadays, it's not safe. That people have to realize. What happened in Brazil a few years ago and recently in Cyprus can happen again. Whereas my gold in my safe, and I won't tell you where I keep it in my office or the garden, but it is relatively safe, not 100% safe, but relatively safe.
Well, of course, you've just raised the very important subject of bail-ins, because so many people think, I'll tell you what, I mean, there's a tail risk here. I'll go into cash. And we see the money markets. People don't realize they can be gated. They could be bail-ins at any time. We don't know. No one's seen the balance sheet of these banks, really seen the balance sheet of these banks. So you mentioned bail-in. It makes you laugh, right?
I'd like to see the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah. And there are 8,000 odd tons of rehypothecated gold, very likely. Many ownership claims probably on it, but I think, you talk about bail-ins, and Switzerland, of course, we have many clients from Switzerland. But what's interesting, Mark, is that, and I remember we talked about this in 2021, and it's still going on. Large client, if I'm not a well-connected Swiss client and I don't have a very good lawyer and I want to take more than 200,000 Swiss francs, or maybe 300 at a max, out of the bank, I can't. It is actually, you run into huge problems. And this actually involved one client who had 500 tons of gold, which has been there for 30 years or something. And we said, go and get it. And they produced a list. First thing they did was produce a list, and no longer did it have bar numbers on it. I think, and then they mentioned to him, in 2002 we changed the rules. I don't know if that's true, but he said changed all the rules. But there was no bar numbers on this, and so they viewed it as money. It's unallocated gold. They viewed it as money, and it took lawyers and money for him to get his gold back.
Yes, I can believe that. The government is an institution to steal money from ordinary people.
The last thing they want is you taking your cash out of the bank and putting it in your own private vault.
They will do everything against ordinary people. And so you have to take precautions ahead of time. So
on the 1st of January in 2023, the Bank of International Settlements recategorized gold as a first-year asset class. So, and basically since then, essentially, it's running alongside bonds as an asset class. And in fact, interesting, I just want to bring, I'm sure you know this, but the World Gold Council, I think just last week or the week before, suggested European pension funds, specifically Swiss pension funds, invest in gold versus bonds. And actually, when we're at the fixes, when we monitor the fixes and the various rounds at the fixes, and you know where the footprints are coming from, it's pretty sure that Swiss money is evident at the fixes. So this is an interesting situation.
Yes, look, I don't want to go into the details, but the fact is simply, let's say 40 years ago, if you look at gold reserves and you look at the financial market, then gold reserves were very large as a percentage of the value of stocks and bonds. And today, the global financial market is a huge bubble. And the gold, you would hardly notice it. It would be just a dot like this in this whole world of financial markets. And of course, if you want to have some security, I would suggest, but I've done this for the last 40, 50 years, to say, put part of the money that you have or that you earn into gold physically and keep it in a safe with an institution, or keep some with yours. But this is something relatively safe. It's not the best investment. You made much more money by owning Microsoft over the last 30 years than by owning gold. But you also made much more money by holding gold instead of stocks that went bust after the dot-com bust and the meme stock bust and the SPAC bust and so forth and so on. So it's something very safe. It's not the best to own, but it's safe. Let's put it this way. Like if you have a life insurance, it's best that you don't need it immediately. But your relatives may be happy to have a life insurance on your head.
Yes, not so funny, really, but yes. And I think, but it's amazing how again these sometimes we work and work and work. We miss some of the bigger picture. Then I looked at a Bank of America report a week ago that says that assesses that gold has now surpassed the euro to become the second largest reserve asset after the US dollar.
Yeah, it's possible. I doubt it, but it's possible.
That again, their assessment, but I think even that fails to capture. And what we do is obviously we're in the wholesale market, and we see a lot of empirical evidence that 400-ounce monetary gold that isn't reported. You don't need to, as you know, report monetary gold transactions, and I think we see a lot of that entering into the BRICS nations, whether it's China, Russia, and essentially the BRICS nations as we think of them. It's on a much larger scale than I think people realize.
Yeah, I mean, if you are China or Russia or any nation and you have slight objections to the foreign policies of the US, you'd be mad to keep US dollar reserves in the United States. You understand? They can freeze your money. I mean, if I have assets, I don't want to have some dumb bureaucrat without any proper education freeze my assets.
Well, I mean,
you have to be really brain damaged to keep all your reserves in the United States. I mean, quite frankly, the dollar also, I have to say this, and I've been traveling a lot all my life, and you can measure the price level here and the price level there. And so, yes, say Singapore is expensive, but it's also very safe. You understand? I'm prepared to pay something for my personal security. If I walk at night in Singapore, I can walk drunk or sober or whatnot. Nobody will attack me. But the other cities in Europe and the US and so forth is no longer safe. So the price level is high. But in other countries, say, I live in Thailand, the price level, I'd say, is about 70% lower than in the United States. For food, maybe 80% lower. But there are items that are more expensive. If I want to buy a Porsche car or a Ferrari, which is not necessarily my desire, but because I had it already, but it would be more expensive because the import duty on luxury goods are very high.
Speaking about the bonds, now I realize from everything I've read, there's opportunities there. But just a question, Mark, just from a simplistic perspective, because US debt is expanding at like $1 trillion every 90 days, and it's $1 trillion of interest cost. It's expanding. Is there risk of a buyer strike that could drive the rates back up to 1980s levels? And we all know what happened then.
I like the way you say your simplistic questions or thoughts, because it's very complex, like the previous question about the valuation of gold. But I am long some government bonds in the US, but with reservations, and I explain to you why. At the present time, and this is my view, but other people may have different views. The bond market over the last 3 years or 4 years, since the high of the bond market and the low of interest rates in August 2000, so 4 years ago. Since then, interest rates have gone up a lot in the US, and the long bonds, the government bonds, they have tumbled, okay? Say we take TLT, the ETF, long-term government bond ETF, has tumbled to a low last October. Since then, interest rates on the short end have been kind of easing a bit. And the bonds have rallied recently. Now, the reason I own these bonds is I think the economy is much weaker, and it will be revealed very soon because the Biden administration has been lying about everything. I don't know a greater lying machine than the Biden administration. That's a complete joke. And so the view of other foreigners than the Democrats in the US. Anyway, so on that basis, maybe bonds can rally somewhat. The other thing that you brought up about the financing needs of the government arising from the fiscal deficits, and this is unusual now in these elections, both candidates have no intention whatsoever to reduce government spending. Under both presidential candidates, their names will disappear, hopefully, from history soon. But under both, government spending will go up. Under the Republicans, more on that side of the economy, on the Democrats, more on that side of the economy. In any way, the deficits are here to stay, and the financing needs will go up. And so, after a period of diminishing inflation, which we are in at the present time, inflation will go up. And as you pointed out, in my view, we will see interest rates much higher than in 1980, when the 10 years touched more than 15%. So we could go to interest rates like in Turkey, 60, 100%, or like in Argentina. That is the model. The model under Harris is the Venezuelan inflation model. That is for sure. That is the future of America if Harris is elected.
Well, if you're the average asset manager right now, you were probably still in school in the 1980s, in the early stages of your schooling in the 1980s. So they would have no clue as to how these tail risks are there. But I think, having never encountered them, Mark.
Well, if they are intellects, and if they study at the proper university under the right teachers, they would read, for instance, The History of Interest Rates by Sidney Homer. All described how inflation accelerated in the 70s. And then there's this book, The Great American Bond Market, Selected Speeches. That spells out the bond strategy in a rising interest rates environment. And then they would maybe go out of their way for a minute, and instead of watching TikTok the whole day, read The Economics of Inflation, where it's spelled out the social influences of inflation on a society by Bresciano Turoni. If they would do that, they would understand that once you embark, and I said it in 2008, in December, they asked me on TV when Bernanke introduced QE1, they asked me when will they reverse these policies. I said, QE infinity has begun. Infinity. Once you start printing money, It's one of the most difficult things to do to stop it.
So what hedges do you think these guys then, if they're educated and they are understanding of what you've just talked about, if you're in the risk markets and you're a pack acting as a pack, and obviously the guy that doesn't buy the bubble gets fired, I mean, it beggars the question, what kind of hedges should these guys be looking at?
Look, in my view, in the kind of monetary environment we're in, there may be no hedges, but the best you can do is gradually keep on accumulating gold. It will not always go up, but when it will go down, it will keep some value. But there's also a risk in gold because the government can say, well,
yes,
3 years ago we locked you up, and now we are going to lock up your gold. We collect it.
Yes, but I think it gets back to kind of what you mentioned before when there's this attack on businesses, but essentially cash is under attack. And I noticed that in this country, for example, if you're a cash business, you've largely been debanked. And when you consider that banking is a utility as important as electricity and water, that's a big deal. And I think one of my friends is Nigel Farage, who is the leader of the Reform Party here. And I've been a guest on his show, and he was debanked by Coutts Bank. And then it turned out that because he had a name and he had a TV program and he was able to talk about it, it turned out that there was literally, he uncovered hundreds of thousands of people with the same problem being debanked, not just for cash, but simply because they didn't have the same view as the bank. To me, this is very worrying.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, look, if you want to worry, you would never sleep. Or you drink a lot. I mean, but as I said, I think we cannot rely on the government anymore to defend the interest of ordinary people. This was actually the original thought of democracy: is you have a government that represents the people. The government today represents one interest alone, its own interest. They have no interest whatsoever in the individual who works in a small shop somewhere in the UK or the US. Zero interest.
Yeah, and I think so. Now, we look ahead, and I appreciate you. I've got value of your time here, but so really, just a couple more little questions here. Little questions.
I like your little questions.
But it's just so interesting to have you here. And I think now, while Basel III, you can argue in holistically whether that was good or not, but certainly was good for gold. But what I'm looking at now is very glossed over and bitsy information about a very draconian Basel IV plans, or the Basel IV plans. Essentially, if it's hard to sum the whole lot up, but essentially what it says, they're talking about recategorizing loans to businesses as high risk. That's enough to cripple the credit capacity of all global banks, actually, making business loans and mortgages almost impossible to obtain. And that in turn is going to severely cut the credit capacity of all of the 60 plus BIS compliant global banks. And it's going to increase their capital requirements to unsustainable levels. Now, I'm just trying to sort of distill these pages and pages of information. Bottom line, this looks like it's the precursor that will ultimately eliminate small businesses, driving mega corporations who will become the employers, and we'll all put our hands out, please feed me, and ultimately introduce this universal credit system where ownership of any asset is just deemed to be unnecessary. This, to me, is what Basel IV is being hidden, but it's bubbling up to the top somewhere.
Yes, I don't know the details of all this, and there are countries that still value individual property rights and so forth.
Yeah.
And I live in one. But it may change and may be under attack at some point. But I think that what you suggested is an issue, and it's been discussed already by economists like Schumpeter, who essentially argued how capitalism slides into socialism for a variety of reasons. He gave a speech about this subject about 6 months before he died in 1949. It's very interesting because it relates to power and the relationship between government and the business, and the power of the government, the power of businesses and so forth. You want to essentially eliminate the small guys and concentrate everything into one big corporation that is controlled by the government. But let's hope that we can avoid this. And I always say I'm in a position where I can do something because I'm independently financially, and I have a certain voice. I have a newsletter and so forth. So because I can, I must, and I must fight the government on every issue, But other people, you see, they are employed by a corporation, say Citibank, or I don't know, whatever, Unilever and so forth. The government has a relationship with that corporation, and they do business together, and they hand out subsidies, and they collect some tax, but not enough, and so forth. The employee of that corporation, even if he wanted to speak out, he cannot, because he will be sacked by his corporation. Sacked. But that, I argue in Switzerland, that the rich people don't stand up against the socialists. They should fight the socialists on every issue. But they don't dare because they are afraid of the socialists. Look at me. I live in outside Switzerland for the last 54 years, okay? Now, I'm 78 years old. What happened to me, and I don't need to pay tax in Switzerland, except on the property in Switzerland. What happened to me after 50 years living outside Switzerland with no tax liability in Switzerland, suddenly I get a letter from the IRS in Switzerland, the tax authorities. They want to know this detail and that detail and so forth. I said to them, you should have come when I was 45 years old and 50, when I was a high earner, not at 78 years of age.
Goodness me. I tell you what, I think, Mark, you've been so generous with your time. And I think there's one thing, and this is really the last question I will say. Look, and it's more of a comment. We have the opportunity, at least we have an opportunity of taking responsibility for ourselves, for our families, our friends. It is a responsibility that we must use. We must use what we've learned and what we're learning from these conversations. We must share it. And obviously, what we're going to say, other than gold and silver, which is so obvious, is there anything else really that you can think of that we should be doing?
Well, I mean, I think that real estate has some value because it's difficult to take the real estate away from all the people. But I will give you an example. The Bolsheviks in Russia, they took the real estate away from the peasants. And they were under the Tsar. It was not an ideal system, Russia, believe me. But the farmers and small business owners had the opportunity to accumulate some savings and relative wealth. After the takeover by the Bolsheviks, you know what happened to agricultural production? It declined by 70%. 70. That is the work of the socialists. The socialists nowadays, they come hidden in green ideologies. and in socialist world improvers. That is unbelievable. But this is the reality of the work of socialism. Once the government owns something, of course, people work when it's their own business. They work twice as much as if they work for an employer.
So true. And I think you've encapsulated that really well.
And people like to work for their own businesses. They hate to work for someone else.
Well, Mark, people, obviously we're going to put up the links to your website, and there's a ton of information in there. People can choose to take responsibility to the degree they want to. And I think they must, absolutely must. What we've just discussed is a must. And I think we'll be looking in the rearview mirror at, from what I see and from what you're saying, and I believe it empirically. I without any doubt, I believe it. That this is the time to act. And I think, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, because as you say, bail-ins can happen. They don't warn you about these things. I mean, it could be the CRE shoe drops next. It could be any one of the many, many things. But people really must take responsibility. So they can land on your website. They can choose to subscribe. They can draw information from you. And naturally, you've got books that you've written. And you've just demonstrated, you've just given us 3 books that are a must read for those people that are still really trying to understand and make good decisions for themselves. So I would encourage people to land on there. And other than that, it's so nice to even talk to you. I mean, I don't know many people that have got a nice smile like you, Mark. Well, look, thank you. Thank you for sharing your time with us today, and really would love to circle back at another time because, as I say, maybe we've just entered the fourth quarter. It's going to be really interesting as we exit this fourth quarter, and so much going on. BRICS summit coming up on the 22nd. Could be some big changes in the way money flows. So lots of things to come back to circle back on. Perhaps in the new year, if you would be so happy to join us.
Yes, with pleasure.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Savati Kraf. Thank you very much.
Bless you.
All right. Thank you, Andrew Maguire and Dr. Marc Faber, for another in-depth discussion. We knew it would be in-depth. And remember, to our whole community, buy physical, make sure it's backed 1-to-1, and understand the difference between what Andy calls the casino paper gold and silver markets and the actual physical gold and silver markets. They're not the same, and don't be fooled. So there you have it. That's all we have for you today on another amazing episode of Live from the Vault. And please help keep spreading the word about this channel. It really does help the show by clicking that like button right there. If you haven't done that already, do it right now and share this information so we can get this news out to more and more people. If you haven't already subscribed, you can do so by clicking on the subscribe button. And if you click on that bell right there, we will notify you as each episode goes live. And with that, we will see you next time right here on Live from the Vault. We'll see you then.